He fixed an Apache woman's wagon. By morning, warriors in war paint surrounded his cabin. The rifle crack split the dawn air before Jake Carson even opened his eyes. He rolled off his cot and hit the floor as another bullet punched through the window shutter, spraying splinters across the room. Through the gap, he counted 12 Apache warriors circling his cabin on horseback, faces painted for war, weapons raised. His heart hammered against his ribs. This was no random raid. They wanted him specifically. The woman. It had to be about the woman whose wagon he'd fixed yesterday evening on the trail. Jake crawled to his gun rack and pulled down his Winchester, checking the rounds. 15 shots. Not nearly enough if this turned into a siege. He'd been a fool to help her without thinking through the consequences. But when he'd seen her struggling with that broken wheel hub 3 miles from his property line, the axle cracked clean through. He couldn't just ride past. She'd been alone, her supply wagon loaded heavy with blankets and dried meat, heading north toward the reservation lands. Her dark eyes had studied him with suspicion when he'd dismounted, but she'd accepted his help after he'd shown her his toolbox. Working in the fading light, Jake had jacked up the wagon, removed the damaged axle, and welded a replacement piece using scrap iron from his saddlebag. The woman had watched every move, never speaking, her hand never far from the knife at her belt. He had respected that caution. These were dangerous times for her people and his. The territorial governor had been pushing Apache families onto smaller parcels, and tensions ran hot as summer stones. When he'd finished, she'd nodded once and driven away without a word. Jake had thought nothing more of it, riding home as stars emerged overhead. Now he understood his mistake. Someone had seen them together. Someone had told the warriors that a white settler had approached one of their women. In Apache culture, that could mean anything from insult to threat, depending on who was doing the interpreting. Another volley of shots pounded the cabin walls. Jake Duck walked to the back window and risked a glance outside. More warriors there, cutting off his escape route to the barn where his horse waited. They had him boxed in completely. Smart tactics. These weren't random raiders. They were experienced fighters, probably veterans of the campaigns against the cavalry, men who knew how to coordinate an attack. He had to think fast. Shooting back would only confirm whatever story they'd been told about him. It would turn this into a massacre, his massacre. But doing nothing meant they'd eventually rush the cabin and he'd die anyway. Jake's mind raced through options as bullets continued to slam into the wood walls. The cabin was solid, built from thick pine logs that could withstand rifle fire for a while, but they could burn him out easily enough if they chose to. The shooting stopped suddenly. In the ringing silence that followed, Jake heard a voice calling out in English. "White man, come out. We talk." The accent was thick but clear. Jake pressed his back against the wall, weighing his choices. Walking out could be a death sentence. Staying in definitely was. He had maybe one chance to explain about the wagon, about helping, about meaning no disrespect. If they'd listen. If whoever was leading this group valued talking over revenge, his hands were slick with sweat on the rifle stock. Through the shutter gaps he could see the sun climbing higher, painting the desert hills gold and red. Beautiful morning to die, he thought bitterly. Then he made his decision. Jake stood slowly, keeping his rifle pointed at the floor. He moved to the door and called back, "I'm coming out. My rifle stays inside." He waited, barely breathing. After a long moment, the voice answered, "Come now." Slow, hands up. Jake propped his Winchester against the doorframe and lifted both hands above his head. His fingers found the door latch, and he pushed it open, stepping into the bright morning sunlight and the circle of armed warriors who wanted him dead. The leader sat his horse directly in front of the cabin, a man perhaps 50 years old with gray streaking his long black hair. 3 white stripes marked his left cheek, and his eyes burned with controlled anger. Behind him, the other warriors held their positions, rifles and bows ready. Jake noticed one young fighter looked barely 16, his war paint still wet on his face, his hands shaking slightly on his weapon. Nervous youth were dangerous in situations like this. One wrong move and they'd all open fire. "You touch now, Lynn," the leader said flatly. It wasn't a question. Jake's throat went dry. So they knew her name. That meant she was important, maybe the daughter or wife of someone powerful. "I fixed her wagon wheel," Jake answered carefully. "The axle broke on the north trail. I had tools. I repaired it. That's all." She went on her way. The leader's face remained stone. "Why you help?" The question hung in the air between them. Jake knew his answer mattered more than anything he'd ever said in his life. "Because it was the right thing to do," Jake said simply. "Broken wagon in this territory, alone, that's dangerous for anyone. I didn't care about who she was. I just saw someone who needed help." Several warriors muttered among themselves in Apache. The young one's rifle barrel dipped slightly. That might be a good sign. Or it might mean nothing.
The leader studied Jake for a long moment, then spoke again.
My warriors saw white men approach her. They say you put hands on Wagon, on her belongings. Jake nodded slowly. Yes. To fix the axle. I didn't touch her. I didn't threaten her. Ask her yourself. The leader raised one hand, and Jake's stomach dropped. This was it, the signal to fire. He tensed, ready to dive, knowing he'd never make it. But instead of gunfire, he heard hoofbeats. Another rider emerged from the tree line to the east. Jake's eyes widened. It was her. Nayland rode toward the cabin on a paint horse, her long black hair loose around her shoulders, the same determined expression on her face that he'd seen yesterday. She pulled up beside her father and spoke rapidly in Apache, gesturing toward Jake and then toward the trail. Her father listened without interrupting, his face unreadable. The other warriors shifted in their saddles, clearly surprised by her arrival. Part 2 would continue from this tense moment, developing how Nalin's testimony changes the situation, leading to unexpected complications that raised the stakes even higher. Nalin finished speaking and turned her horse to face the gathered warriors directly. Her voice carried across the clearing, sharp and commanding despite her youth. Jake couldn't understand the Apache words, but he recognized the tone of someone defending their position fiercely. Several warriors looked away, unable or unwilling to meet her gaze. Her father remained motionless on his horse, processing everything she'd told him. Finally, the older man raised his hand for silence. He looked at Jake with an expression that might have been reassessment or might have been the calm before violence. My daughter says you helped her with respect. She says you turned your back while she checked the repair, that you did not watch her, did not try to see into her wagon. This is truth? Jake nodded carefully. Yes, I worked on the wheel, tested it, then walked to my horse while she inspected everything. I waited until she was ready to leave. The leader's jaw tightened. Then we have problem. Jake's confusion must have shown on his face because the man continued, My warriors saw you help Nayland. They saw this and did not stop it. They washed and rode away. They came to village and said, White man touched our woman's property, came close to her, put hands on her belongings. They said this to elders, to other warriors. They said we must act, must defend honor. Many wanted to come here last night. I made them wait for dawn so heads could cool. He paused, letting the implication sink in. Now Nayland tells different story. Says you showed respect, helped without asking for anything, left her alone. If this is true, then my warriors lied to start a fight. Or they exaggerated to make themselves look protective when they did nothing to stop you if they thought you were a threat. Jake began to understand the real problem. This wasn't about him anymore. It was about internal politics. About warriors who'd seen a chance to prove their vigilance and had twisted the truth to make themselves look better. Now they were committed to their version of events, and backing down would shame them in front of the tribe. Nalin's father was caught between believing his daughter and avoiding humiliation for his fighters. I have a suggestion, Jake said slowly, aware that he was walking a knife edge. Your warriors did their duty. They saw a white man near one of your women and came to investigate. That's exactly what they should have done. There's no shame in that. They came here ready to protect Nalin's honor. That's commendable. He gestured to the cabin and the bullet holes. They showed strength and coordination. I'm impressed. But now your daughter has explained the situation. Honor has been satisfied. Everyone did their job correctly, no insults were given, and none need to be taken. The young warrior with the shaky hands spoke up suddenly, his voice tight. He lies. I saw him stand close to her. Too close. She moved away from him. Nayland wheeled her horse toward him, her eyes flashing. She snapped something in Apache that made the young man's face flush dark red. Her father held up a hand again, but Nayland ignored him, continuing to berate the younger warrior in a stream of words that had several other men hiding smiles behind their hands. Jake stood frozen, knowing better than to move or speak. The dynamics playing out before him were complex, clearly involving tribal relationships and hierarchies he couldn't fully understand. When Nalin finally stopped talking, the young warrior looked like he wanted the earth to swallow him. Her father spoke quietly to him, and the young man nodded stiffly, his jaw clenched in barely suppressed anger. The leader turned back to Jake. My daughter says Billy here has wanted to court her for 2 seasons. She has refused him every time. She says he is using this situation to make her look like she needs his protection, to make himself look strong in front of elders. She says this is foolish boy thinking, not warrior thinking. Billy, the young warrior, gripped his rifle tighter, his knuckles white. Jake could see the humiliation and rage building in the kid's eyes. This was getting worse, not better. "With respect," Jake said carefully, addressing the leader but keeping Billy in his peripheral vision. "Young men everywhere do foolish things when they're trying to impress someone. I did plenty myself at his age. The important thing is nobody got hurt yesterday, and nobody needs to get hurt today. Your daughter's safe. Her wagon's fixed. That's what matters." The leader nodded thoughtfully. "You speak sense. This is why I am chief and not these hotheads." He gestured at his warriors with something between affection and exasperation. "We will leave now. There is no quarrel here." But Billy wasn't ready to let it go. He urged his horse forward a few steps, his voice rising. "He should pay for touching Apache property. White men always take what they want. They take our land, our water, our hunting grounds. Now they touch our women's belongings like they own everything." Several other young warriors murmured agreement. Jake's heart sank. This was the real issue beneath the surface, the accumulated grievances and resentments that had nothing to do with him specifically, but everything to do with what he represented. Nolan's father's voice cracked like a whip. "Enough." But Billy continued, his words tumbling out faster now, directed at the other warriors. "My grandfather fought the Blue Coats at Canyon Creek. My uncle died in the reservation wars. And now we ride away because a white man says nice words? We let him put his hands on our belongings, our women, our pride?" He was working himself into a frenzy, and Jake could see other warriors starting to nod, their earlier uncertainty replaced by rekindled anger. Jake knew what was coming next. He'd seen it before in saloon fights and range disputes. Someone had to back down or someone had to fight, and there was no middle ground once pride got this tangled up in the situation. He calculated distances, 20 feet to the cabin door. His rifle just inside. Against 12 armed men on horseback, he'd last maybe 10 seconds. But standing here empty-handed while tensions escalated wasn't much better. Then Naylin did something that surprised everyone. She dismounted, walked straight to Billy's horse, and grabbed his reins. "Get down," she commanded in English, clearly wanting Jake to understand. "You want to fight for my honor? Then fight me. I choose this white man's help. I choose to accept his kindness. If you cannot accept my choice, then you do not respect me. You only want to control me." Billy looked stricken. "Nalin, I am trying to protect you." She laughed bitterly. "I do not need protection from men who fix broken wagon wheels. I need protection from men who think they own my decisions." The other warriors shifted uncomfortably. Several looked at the chief, waiting for him to intervene, but the older man sat motionless, watching his daughter with an expression that might have been pride or concern or both. Billy's face cycled through emotions, confusion, anger, hurt, desperation. "You would shame me in front of everyone?" he asked quietly. Naylon's voice softened slightly, but remained firm. "You are shaming yourself. The white man did nothing wrong. I did nothing wrong. You are making a problem where none exists because you cannot accept that I do not want to marry you." The truth hung in the air like smoke. Jake almost felt sorry for Billy. The kid was in love and making terrible decisions because of it, something Jake understood from painful personal experience. But sympathy wouldn't save anyone if this situation exploded into violence. He had to do something to give Billy a way out that didn't involve more humiliation or gunfire. "Billy," Jake said, drawing the young warrior's attention. "You remind me of my younger brother Danny. He fell hard for a girl back in Missouri, Sarah Coleman. She didn't love him back, and it ate him up inside. Made him do stupid things trying to prove himself worthy. Nearly got himself killed twice in fights he picked with her other suitors. You know what finally worked?" Billy stared at him, wary, but listening. He stopped trying so hard. Backed off, focused on being a good man rather than trying to be her man. And you know what happened? She noticed. Started seeing him different. They've been married 4 years now. It was complete fiction. Jake had no brother named Danny, but the story served its purpose. Several warriors nodded knowingly. Universal recognition of youthful romantic struggles crossing cultural boundaries. Billy's grip on his rifle loosened slightly. "I am not trying too hard," he muttered, but the fire had gone out of his voice. "Maybe not," Jake agreed. "But you're trying right now, in this moment, and it's not working. Your chief wants to leave. Nalin wants to leave. The only one keeping everyone here is you. Is this really how you want her to remember today?" Billy's shoulders sagged. He looked at Nalin, who met his gaze steadily, waiting. After a long moment, he turned his horse away, heading toward the tree line without another word. 2 other young warriors followed him, probably friends wanting to offer support or commiseration. The chief watched them go, then turned back to Jake. "You are clever with words." "You should have been a diplomat instead of a settler," Jake smiled weakly. "I just fix things. Wagons, fences, problems. It's what I do." The chief studied him for another moment, then nodded. "You are welcome to ride through our territory without fear. If you see any of our people in need of fixing, you may help them. But be careful. Not all of my warriors are as reasonable as I am, and young men in love are dangerous everywhere." He raised his hand in a gesture of farewell, then wheeled his horse. The remaining warriors followed, the circle around Jake's cabin dissolving as they rode toward the tree line. Nalin lingered, still standing by her paint horse. When the others had ridden out of earshot, she approached Jake. "Thank you for not shooting. Many white men would have fired first." Jake shrugged. "Wouldn't have accomplished anything except getting me killed. Your father seems like a reasonable man. I hope talking might work better than bullets." She smiled slightly. "My father is wise, but he is also proud. If you had insulted him or our people, even accidentally, he would have ordered your death without hesitation. You chose your words carefully." "I had good motivation," Jake admitted. 12 rifles pointed at me focuses the mind wonderfully. Nalin laughed, a warm sound that seemed at odds with the tension of the past hour. "Will Billy be all right?" Jake asked.
He's sobered.
"He is young and his feelings are hurt, but he will survive. My father will talk to him, help him understand. But you should be careful if you see him alone on the trails. Young men with wounded pride sometimes do foolish things for revenge."
Jake nodded. "I'll watch my back."
"And thank you for coming, for telling them the truth." "You didn't have to do that." Nalin met his eyes. "Yes, I did. You showed me respect when you did not have to. When many white men would have demanded payment or worse. Honor requires truth, even when truth is uncomfortable." She mounted her horse in one smooth motion. "My father meant what he said. You are welcome in our territory. But the welcome only extends to you, Jake Carson. Make sure other settlers know they cannot use your name as protection. That would end badly." "Understood," Jake said. "One more thing," Nalin said, gathering her reins. "The elders will want to know about you now. Some will be curious. Some will be suspicious. You may receive visitors in the coming weeks. Be patient with them. Answer their questions honestly. They will be judging whether you're trustworthy or a threat." Jake felt a knot forming in his stomach. "I just wanted to fix a wagon wheel." Nalin smiled. "You fixed more than a wheel. You fixed a connection between 2 peoples who have been breaking for a long time. Small connections matter. Maybe they stop bigger breaks from happening." With that cryptic comment, she urged her horse into a trot, heading toward the tree line where her people had disappeared. Jake watched until she vanished into the shadows beneath the pines, then turned to survey the damage to his cabin. Bullet holes pocked the walls, shattered glass glittered in the dirt, and his door hung crooked on its hinges. He sighed. Fixing things was his specialty, but he just learned that some repairs came with consequences he couldn't predict. He walked inside to begin repairs, his mind already working through problems of wood and nails, much simpler than problems of honor and pride and the complicated spaces between cultures. The sun climbed higher, promising another scorching day. Jake worked through the morning, patching bullet holes with scrap lumber, replacing window glass from his small stock of supplies. His hands stayed busy, but his mind kept returning to Billy's face, to that mixture of shame and rage that had filled the young warrior's eyes. Jake had made an enemy today without meaning to, just by being kind to a stranger on the trail. He wondered what his brother would have thought about that. His real brother, not the fictional Danny he'd invented to defuse the situation. Peter Carson had been dead 3 years now, killed by fever in a winter that had taken half the settlement. Before he died, Peter had told Jake to keep helping people, to never let fear or suspicion turn him into the kind of man who rode past those in need. It was good advice, Jake thought, but it sure did complicate life sometimes. By noon, the cabin was mostly repaired. Jake stood back to examine his work, noting the fresh wood patches that stood out pale against the weathered logs. The bullet holes were covered, but the scars remained visible. Kind of like the morning's events, he supposed. The surface tension was resolved, but the underlying issues remained, waiting beneath the temporary peace. He needed supplies from town, nails and glass and coffee, but the thought of leaving his property unguarded made him nervous. What if Billy came back? What if other warriors who hadn't been present this morning heard a different version of events and decided to finish what their friends had started? Jake shook his head. He couldn't live his life paralyzed by fear of what might happen. If Nalen's father had given his word about safe passage, Jake had to trust that meant something. He saddled his horse, a steady roan mare named Lucy, checked his rifle, and headed toward the settlement of Red Creek, 15 miles south. The ride passed uneventfully through pine forests and sage flats, the summer sun beating down hard. Jake kept alert, scanning the ridges for watchers, but saw no one. Either the Apache had truly moved on, or they were better at hiding than he was at spotting them. Probably both. Red Creek consisted of 24 buildings clustered around a crossroads, serving the scattered ranches and mining claims in the territory. Jake tied Lucy outside Brennan's general store and went inside, blinking as his eyes adjusted to the dimness. Old man Brennan looked up from his counter, his weathered face creasing into a frown. Jake Carson. Surprised to see you alive. Word's going around that the Apache paid you a visit this morning. Full war party, 12 riders all painted up. That true? Jake tensed. News traveled fast, even in empty country like this. Who told you that? Brennan shrugged. Cattle buyer came through an hour ago. Said he saw Apache riders heading toward your land at dawn, all armed for battle. We figured they'd burnt you out or worse. He looked Jake up and down. Clearly you're still breathing. What happened? Other customers in the store had stopped to listen. 3 men and a woman Jake recognized from surrounding ranches. Everyone wanted to know how a lone settler had survived what sounded like certain death. Jake chose his words carefully. There was a misunderstanding. I helped prepare a wagon for an Apache woman yesterday. Some warriors thought I'd been inappropriate. We talked it out. Nobody got hurt. Simple as that. One of the men, a rancher named Cole Fletcher, snorted. Talked it out? With Apache? You're either the luckiest man alive or the biggest liar in the territory. Jake felt his temper rise but kept his voice level. I'm telling you what happened, Cole. Believe it or not, that's your business. Fletcher stepped closer. His eyes narrowed with suspicion. Maybe you're working with them. Maybe you're helping them scout out settlements, telling them which ranches to hit, which folks are alone and vulnerable. That would explain why they let you live. The accusation hung in the air, poisonous and dangerous. Jake could see the other customers reconsidering him, doubt creeping into their expressions. Brennan's hand moved subtly toward the shotgun he kept under the counter. This was going bad quickly. Part 3 would continue from this new crisis, as Jake faces suspicion from his own people while trying to maintain the fragile peace he'd established with the Apache. That's ridiculous, Jake said, keeping his hands visible and away from his gun belt. I've lived here 3 years, Cole. I've helped every one of you at some point. Fixed your pump last winter, if you recall. Why would I suddenly turn traitor? Fletcher's jaw worked, clearly wanting to believe the worst, but lacking real evidence. Times are strange. People do unexpected things, and you're mighty calm for someone who just had 12 Apache warriors surrounding his cabin at dawn. Most men would be shaking, maybe riding straight to the territorial marshal to report an attack, but here you are, casual as Sunday, buying supplies like nothing happened. Jake realized that his composure was working against him. He should be more visibly shaken, more eager to share his close call with death. His calm demeanor looked suspicious to people already primed to distrust any interaction with the Apache. I'm calm because I'm tired, Jake said, injecting some weariness into his voice, which wasn't hard, since it was true. I've been up since before dawn, had guns pointed at me for an hour, then spent the morning patching bullet holes in my cabin walls. I'm here because I need supplies to finish repairs. That's the whole story. The woman, Martha Keegan, spoke up from near the pickle barrel. What was the misunderstanding about? You said you helped an Apache woman. What kind of help? There was no accusation in her tone, just genuine curiosity, and Jake felt a flicker of hope. Martha ran a boarding house in Red Creek and had a reputation for fairness. Her wagon axle broke on the North Trail, Jake explained. She was alone, heading toward reservation lands with supplies. I had tools. I fixed the axle and went home. Some warriors saw us and thought I'd been threatening her or taking liberties. Her father brought warriors to my cabin to defend her honor, but then she arrived and told them the truth, that I'd been respectful and helpful. They left peacefully. Martha nodded slowly. That sounds reasonable. A broken wagon in this country is serious business. You did right helping her, Jake. Fletcher wasn't convinced. Or he's made some kind of deal with them. Safe passage in exchange for information. I've heard of white men doing that, playing both sides. Jake's patience snapped. Then you've heard wrong, or you've been listening to too many campfire stories. I'm not a spy or a traitor. I'm a man who helped someone in need, and I'm not going to apologize for that. Brennan cleared his throat. Easy, both of you. Jake, I believe you're telling the truth. Known you long enough to trust your word. But Cole's got a point about how this looks. Settlers are nervous. There's been raids up north, ranches burned, livestock stolen. People hear that the Apache paid you a visit and you're still alive. They're going to have questions. You need to be ready with answers that make sense. Jake nodded, his anger cooling. Fair enough. What do you suggest? Tell your story exactly like you told it just now, Martha said. Most folks will accept it. The ones who don't, well, they weren't going to trust you anyway. Suspicion runs high in dangerous times. She gave Fletcher a pointed look. Some people see enemies everywhere because it's easier than admitting the world is complicated. Fletcher flushed but didn't argue back. Jake made his purchases, paying for nails, glass panes, coffee beans, and ammunition. Brennan packed everything carefully, then leaned across the counter. Watch yourself, Jake. If what you say is true about being welcome in Apache territory, that's a rare thing. But it'll make you stand out. Some folks won't like it. Some folks don't like anything, Jake muttered, gathering his supplies. He nodded to Martha, ignored Fletcher, and walked outside. The street was busier now. Midday traffic of wagons and riders. Several people stared at him with open curiosity. Word was spreading fast. By nightfall, everyone within 20 miles would know about the Apache visit to Jake Carson's cabin. The stories would grow in the telling, becoming more dramatic, more violent, less true. By next week, he'd either be a hero who faced down a war party or a suspicious character who couldn't be trusted. Jake loaded his supplies onto Lucy and mounted up. He was turning the mare north when he heard hoofbeats approaching fast. A rider thundered into town, dust flying, his horse lathered with sweat. Jake recognized him as Pete Garrison, who ran a small ranch 10 miles west. Pete pulled up hard, his face flushed with exertion and alarm. Apache raiders hit the Morrison place, he shouted to the gathering crowd, burnt the barn, ran off their horses, shot Frank Morrison in the leg. Doc's with him now, but he's in bad shape. The crowd erupted in angry muttering. Fletcher pushed forward. When did this happen? Pete dismounted, breathing hard. Last night, near midnight. Frank's wife said there were 4 of them, young warriors, faces painted black. They fired the barn first, then shot Frank when he came running out, took his rifle and both horses, then rode north laughing.
Jake's blood ran cold.
Black face paint meant a raid, not a defensive action. And young warriors, riding at night, taking supplies and weapons, that was serious. It also meant that whatever peace he'd achieved this morning was fragile as glass. Fletcher rounded on Jake immediately. You said everything was peaceful. You said it was all a misunderstanding. Now Frank Morrison's shot, and his barn's ashes.
Jake held up his hands. I didn't know about any raid.
The warriors I met were from a different group, led by a chief. These sound like young ones operating independently. But even as he said it, Jake wondered about Billy. The young warrior had ridden away angry and humiliated. Had he decided to prove himself by attacking a settler? It seemed possible, even likely. Doesn't matter if they're different groups, Pete said angrily. Apache are Apache. If they're raiding, we need to organize a response. Ride to the territorial marshal, get some cavalry support, show them we won't tolerate attacks on our people. Martha interjected, or we could make things worse by overreacting. Frank's alive. The barn can be rebuilt. If we go charging into Apache territory looking for revenge, innocent people on both sides will die.
Fletcher spat in the dirt. Innocent?
There's no such thing as an innocent Apache. They're all warriors or future warriors. Jake knew he should stay silent, knew that anything he said would be used against him given the suspicious mood. But he couldn't let Fletcher's words stand unchallenged. That's not true. I've met Apache women, children, elders. They're people, just like us. Some are warriors. Some aren't. You can't judge them all by the actions of a few raiders. Fletcher's face darkened. Listen to him defend them. I told you he was working with them. Probably warned them that Morrison would be an easy target. Isolated ranch, only one man to defend it. That's enough, Brennan said firmly from the store doorway. Jake wasn't even in town last night. How could he have warned anyone about anything? But the damage was done. Enough people had heard Fletcher's accusation, seen Jake defending the Apache, noticed his unusual survival of a war party visit. Doubt had been planted, and in a frightened community, doubt grew quickly into certainty. Jake could see it in their faces, the way people stepped back slightly, the way hands moved closer to weapons. He'd become a suspect in his own community within minutes of a raid he knew nothing about. I'm going home, Jake announced. I had nothing to do with any raid, If the marshal wants to question me, he knows where I live. He turned Lucy north, but Fletcher grabbed the mare's bridle. Maybe you should stay in town where we can keep an eye on you, at least until we sort out what's going on. Jake looked down at Fletcher's hand on his reins, then up at the man's hostile face. Let go of my horse, Cole. I'm not under arrest. I'm not accused of any crime. Cole, release his horse, Martha said, her voice sharp. You have no authority to detain him. Fletcher hesitated, clearly wanting to press the issue, but Brennan had emerged from the store with his shotgun, not pointed at anyone but definitely present. Let him go, the store owner said quietly. This isn't helping. Fletcher released the bridle and stepped back, but his eyes promised that this conversation wasn't finished. Jake urged Lucy forward, riding out of town at a steady pace, feeling hostile stares boring into his back the whole way. The ride home took 2 hours. Jake used the time to think through the situation, which was deteriorating faster than he could manage. On one side, he'd achieved a fragile peace with the Apache chief and his daughter, but that peace meant nothing if young warriors were conducting independent raids. On the other side, his own community now suspected him of collaboration with the enemy. He was caught between two groups, trusted by neither, vulnerable to both. And somewhere in all this mess was Billy, angry and humiliated, possibly responsible for the Morrison raid, definitely a threat to Jake's safety. As Lucy climbed the final ridge before Jake's property, he saw smoke. His heart lurched. Black smoke rising from where his cabin should be. He kicked the mare into a gallop, racing down the slope, supplies bouncing in his saddlebags. He burst into the clearing and pulled up hard. The cabin still stood, untouched, but his small barn was burning, flames consuming the wooden structure, heat shimmering in waves. His 2 cows were gone, the corral gate open, and painted on the front of his cabin in what looked like blood or red paint were Apache symbols he couldn't read. Jake dismounted and ran for the barn, but the fire was too advanced. Nothing inside could be saved. He watched helplessly as flames ate through the roof, collapsing beams into the structure. The barn had held his tools, his feed supplies, extra saddles, everything he needed to operate his small ranch. Now it was all going up in smoke. When the worst of the fire had burned itself out, Jake circled his property looking for tracks. He found them easily enough, 3 horses, unshod, heading north, young riders based on the track depth. They'd come during the day while he was in town, hit fast, and disappeared. Jake studied the symbols painted on his cabin. He didn't know what they meant, but he could guess. Either a warning or a claim, marking him as connected to the Apache, making him a target for his own people while simultaneously punishing him for embarrassing Billy. It was clever, really. Whoever had done this had made Jake's position impossible. If he reported the raid to the marshal, he'd have to explain the symbols, which would reinforce suspicions about his Apache connections. If he didn't report it, people would wonder why. Either way, he looked guilty. He was still staring at the symbols when he heard horses approaching from the south. Jake grabbed his rifle and took cover behind his water trough, heart pounding. Had the raiders come back? But the riders that emerged from the tree line were white men, a dozen of them, led by Cole Fletcher. They spread out as they entered the clearing surrounding Jake's cabin like the Apache had done that morning. Jake had gone from one siege to another in less than 12 hours. Fletcher pulled up his horse and surveyed the smoking barn wreckage. Well, well. Looks like your Apache friends turned on you. Or is this all staged to throw us off the scent? Jake stood slowly, rifle in hand but pointed down. I was in town buying supplies when this happened. You know that. You saw me leave. Fletcher nodded. But that doesn't mean you didn't arrange it beforehand. Make yourself look like a victim to gain our trust. I've seen con games run that way. One of the other riders, a young man named Tommy Walsh, pointed at the symbols. What do those mean, Carson? Some kind of Apache message? Jake fought to keep his voice calm. I don't know. I can't read the writing. But I'd guess it's either a warning or a way to make me look like I'm working with them. Either way, I've lost my barn and my livestock. That's real enough. Martha Keegan rode up from the back of the group, her face troubled. She'd followed the men from town, probably worried about what they might do. Cole, this doesn't make sense. Why would Jake burn his own barn and steal his own cattle? Fletcher shrugged. To sell them later, split the profit with his Apache partners. Or as part of some bigger plan we haven't figured out yet. Point is, everything about Carson's situation is suspicious. The Apache visit him, but don't kill him. He's calm about it. Hours later, there's a raid on the Morrison place. Then, while Carson's in town, someone hits his property, but leaves him unharmed. It's all too convenient. Or I'm just unlucky, Jake said, his patience wearing thin. Wrong place, wrong time, caught between two groups that are heading toward war, Tommy Walsh spoke up. The territorial marshal is coming. Pete Garrison rode to the fort to report the Morrison raid. Marshal Duncan will be here tomorrow with cavalry support. He'll want to question you about everything, Carson. If I were you, I'd have good answers ready. Jake nodded. I'll tell him exactly what I've told you. The truth. Truth according to you, Fletcher said. But the marshal might see things different. Might decide you're too dangerous to leave free while he investigates. Might decide protective custody in the town jail is the safest option for everyone. Jake's grip tightened on his rifle. I'm not going to jail for crimes I didn't commit. Fletcher's hand moved to his pistol. That's not your decision to make. If the marshal wants you in custody, you'll be in custody. We can do this easy or hard. The other men spread out slightly, hands near weapons. Jake counted odds, 12 against 1. He'd lose any fight. But he'd be damned if he'd surrender his freedom based on nothing but suspicion and bad timing. Martha urged her horse between Fletcher and Jake. This is wrong, and you know it, Cole. You can't arrest someone without evidence. Jake has rights, same as anyone. Fletcher's face flushed. Rights? Tell that to Frank Morrison, lying in his bed with a bullet in his leg. Tell it to his wife, watching their barn burn. Rights matter when we're all safe. Right now, we need to protect this community, and that means making hard choices. He looked past Martha at Jake. Come peacefully, Carson. Don't make this uglier than it has to be. Jake knew he was cornered. If he resisted, they'd shoot him and call it self-defense. If he surrendered, he'd be locked up while events spiraled beyond his control. Somewhere in the hills, Billy or whoever had painted those symbols was laughing, having successfully turned both communities against Jake with one clever raid. He lowered his rifle slowly, buying time to think. Then he heard something that changed everything. A distant sound, growing louder. Drums. Apache war drums, coming from the North Ridge. Fletcher heard them too, his face going pale. What the hell is that? Part 4 would escalate the situation as both groups converge on Jake's property, forcing him into the middle of a confrontation that could either prevent a war or start one. The drums grew louder, pulsing across the valley like a heartbeat. Fletcher and his men turned their horses toward the sound, weapons drawn, faces tight with fear. Jake recognized the rhythm from stories he'd heard. It was a formal announcement, not a war call. Someone important was coming, and they wanted everyone to know about it. Through the trees on the North Ridge, riders emerged. Not a raiding party, but a full delegation. 20 Apache warriors rode in formation, with Nolan's father at the center. They descended the slope slowly, deliberately, making no threatening moves, but projecting unmistakable power. Fletcher wheeled his horse to face Jake, fury and panic mixing in his expression. You knew they were coming. You signaled them somehow? Jake shook his head. I had no idea, but I'm guessing they know about my barn. They probably know about everything. Martha had gone pale, but held her ground. Cole, we should leave. Now, before this turns into a massacre. But Fletcher seemed frozen, unable to decide between retreat and confrontation. His men shifted nervously, horses dancing in place, sensing their riders' fear. The Apache delegation reached the clearing and spread out, mirroring the formation of Fletcher's group. Both sides now faced each other across Jake's burned barn, with Jake standing in the middle like a man caught between hammer and anvil. Nalen's father rode forward alone, stopping 10 feet from Fletcher. His face was grave, and when he spoke, his English carried across the tense silence. I am Chief Standing Bear of the Tonto Apache. We have come to speak about the crimes committed today. Fletcher found his voice, though it shook slightly. Crimes? Your people raided the Morrison Ranch, shot a man, stole horses? That's what we're here about. Standing Bear nodded slowly. Yes. Young warriors from my tribe acted without permission. This brings shame to our people. But there was another crime today. Someone attacked this man's property. He gestured at Jake. Someone painted false symbols on his home. Symbols that no true Apache would use. Symbols designed to make trouble between our peoples. Jake's mind raced. False symbols? That meant the raiders weren't actually Apache, or they were Apache intentionally using the wrong markings. Either way, it suggested a more complex situation than simple retaliation. Fletcher looked confused. What do you mean false symbols? Standing Bear rode closer to Jake's cabin, studying the red-painted marks. He spoke a few words in Apache, and several of his warriors came forward to examine the symbols. They talked among themselves, then one young warrior, whose face Jake didn't recognize, called out angrily. Nalen emerged from the group, dismounting to look closely at the paintings. She turned to Jake, her expression troubled. These symbols are incorrect. They use Apache shapes, but the meanings are wrong, mixed together in ways that make no sense. It is like someone who saw our language once and tried to copy it without understanding. An Apache child would not make these mistakes. She touched the paint, then smelled her fingers. This is not paint we use. It is white man's paint, mixed with something to look like blood. The implications hit Jake like a physical blow. Someone had deliberately sabotaged both sides, painting fake Apache symbols to implicate the tribe while conducting raids that would provoke white retaliation. It was a clever plan to start a war between settlers and Apache, and it had nearly worked. But who would benefit from such a war? Jake's mind immediately went to land speculators, mining companies, anyone who wanted the Apache moved off their traditional territories so valuable land could be claimed. It was an old story in the territories, played out 100 times with different tribes and different villains. Fletcher was having the same realization. His face had gone from red to white. Anger replaced by dawning horror. Someone's playing us. Someone wants us to fight each other. Standing Bear nodded gravely. Yes, someone benefits when Apache and settlers kill each other. When we are weak from fighting, when your government sees us as dangerous enemies, when your people demand we be removed to distant reservations, then our lands become available. This has happened before in other places. We know this pattern. Tommy Walsh spoke up, his voice uncertain. But what about the Morrison raid? That was real. Standing Bear turned to face the young settler. That was real. 3 young warriors from my tribe, angry about broken treaty promises, about shrinking hunting grounds, about watching their families go hungry, they decided to strike back. It was wrong. It was against my orders. They will be punished according to our law. But someone knew they were planning this raid. Someone encouraged them, maybe even told them which ranch to hit. Someone who wanted to make sure violence happened at the right time to trigger more violence. Jake suddenly thought of Billy. The young warrior had been furious this morning, publicly humiliated in front of his peers. What if someone had approached him after he left, offered him a chance to prove himself, suggested that hitting a settler ranch would restore his honor? Billy was young, angry, impulsive, exactly the kind of person who could be manipulated into doing something reckless. Was Billy one of the 3 who raided Morrison's? Jake asked Standing Bear. The chief's eyes narrowed. How do you know that name? Jake explained about the morning's confrontation, about Billy's interest in Nolan, about his anger and humiliation. Standing Bear listened, his face darkening with each detail. When Jake finished, the chief spoke to his warriors in rapid Apache. Several nodded, and one older warrior responded at length. Standing Bear turned back to Jake. Billy did not return to our village last night. His friends say he rode south, toward the border mountains, saying he needed time alone to think. He is one of the 3 who raided your neighbor. My scouts have been tracking them since dawn. Fletcher leaned forward in his saddle. Where are they now? If you hand them over to our marshal, it might prevent this whole situation from exploding. But Standing Bear shook his head. They will face Apache justice, not white man's law. But I will send word to your marshal explaining what happened, and I will pay compensation to the injured man. 3 horses from my own herd, plus silver enough to rebuild his barn. This is our way of taking responsibility for the actions of our warriors. It was a generous offer, more than most Apache tribes would provide given the history of broken promises and stolen lands. Fletcher seemed to recognize this, his posture relaxing slightly. The marshal will still want to investigate. He'll want to know who encouraged these young warriors who might be stirring up trouble on purpose. Standing Bear nodded. We share this question. Someone has been visiting the young men in our village, a white man who speaks some Apache, who tells them stories of great wrongs done to our people, who suggests that violence is the only way to be heard. We thought he was a sympathetic friend. Now we wonder if he has other purposes. Jake felt pieces clicking together. What does this man look like? Standing Bear described him. Middle-aged, tall, thin, with a scar on his left cheek and nervous hands that never stopped moving. He wore good clothes, spoke educated English when dealing with settlers, claimed to be a surveyor mapping the territory for the railroad. Several of Standing Bear's warriors had grown suspicious of him recently, noticing that he asked many questions about Apache strength, about settler defenses, about tensions between the groups. I've seen him, Martha said suddenly. He stayed at my boarding house last month. Said his name was Russell Moore, that he worked for the Territorial Survey Office. He asked a lot of questions about which ranches were isolated, which families might be willing to sell their land cheaply. I thought he was just doing his job. Fletcher cursed. Survey office doesn't exist. It's a made-up position. I should know. I checked into getting survey work done last year, Any official mapping is done directly by the territorial government, not independent contractors. Standing Bear's voice was cold. This Russell Moore has been playing both sides. He tells young Apache warriors they should fight back against white oppression. He paints false symbols to implicate us in raids. He encourages violence so that your soldiers come to force us onto smaller lands that just happen to be worthless while the good lands are sold to his employers, whoever they might be. It is an old trick, but it still works because people like your Mr. Fletcher are quick to suspect, quick to anger, quick to reach for weapons instead of seeking truth. Fletcher had the grace to look ashamed. He glanced at Jake. I owe you an apology, Carson. I was quick to judge, quick to assume the worst. Heat of the moment, fear for the community, but that's no excuse for accusing an innocent man. Jake nodded, accepting the apology. He was too tired to hold grudges and too aware that bigger problems still loomed. We need to find Russell Moore. If he's still in the territory, he's likely planning more trouble. Tommy Walsh cleared his throat. Actually, I think I know where he is. Yesterday in town, I heard him tell Brennan he was heading east to inspect some mining claims in the Silver Creek area. Said he'd be gone for a few days, camping in the high country. Standing Bear turned to his warriors and issued orders. 4 men wheeled their horses and galloped north, probably heading to get more warriors or supplies. We will find this man, the chief said. We will bring him to your marshal and let him explain his actions. If he has done what we suspect, justice will be served. Fletcher nodded. Agreed. And I'll ride to the fort. Let the cavalry commander know what's happening. Last thing we need is soldiers showing up ready to fight when we're trying to solve this peacefully. He looked around at his men. Anyone wants to come with me, you're welcome. Anyone wants to stay here and help Carson rebuild his barn, that would be good too. We owe him for nearly making a terrible mistake. 3 men chose to ride with Fletcher. The rest dismounted, clearly intending to help with repairs. Jake felt a surge of gratitude mixed with embarrassment. He hadn't asked for help, and charity made him uncomfortable, but practical necessity overrode pride. Nayland approached Jake while the men began organizing work details. You have become a bridge between our peoples, she said quietly. Whether you wanted this role or not, there will be more tests ahead. More people like Russell Moore who profit from division and conflict. You must be ready. Jake looked at her, at the wisdom in her young face. I just fixed a wagon wheel. I never asked to be a bridge or a diplomat or anything else. I just wanted to live quietly and help where I could. The best leaders never ask for responsibility, Standing Bear said, joining them. They receive it because they act with honor when others act with fear. You could have lied this morning to save yourself. You could have blamed my people, joined the settlers in demanding revenge. Instead, you told truth even when truth was dangerous. That is leadership. Jake shook his head. I'm not a leader. I'm a man who fixes things. Standing Bear smiled slightly. Things, wagons, fences, problems, divisions between peoples. All different kinds of fixing. All requiring the same skills. Patience, precision, understanding how pieces fit together. Martha Keegan had dismounted and was examining the burned barn remains. This will take at least a week to rebuild properly. Jake, you're welcome to stay at my boarding house until it's done. No charge, considering everything you've been through. Jake started to protest, but she held up a hand. Don't argue. You saved this community from a war we didn't know we were walking into. Taking advantage of my hospitality is the least you can do to let us feel like we're contributing to the solution. Over the next hour, an unlikely coalition formed in Jake Carson's front yard. Settlers and Apache warriors worked side by side, clearing debris from the burned barn, stacking usable lumber, discussing reconstruction plans. Language barriers created some confusion, but goodwill and shared purpose smoothed over the difficulties. Jake watched in amazement as men who had been pointing rifles at each other an hour earlier now passed tools and shared water from the same canteen. It was fragile, this temporary peace, but it was real. As the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, Standing Bear prepared to leave with his warriors. Before mounting, he approached Jake one final time. If you find yourself in trouble, if more or others like him come after you, send a message to our village.
We will come.
You have earned our protection through your honorable actions. This is my promise to you. He placed his hand over his heart, a gesture of serious commitment. Jake mimicked the gesture, feeling the weight of the promise settle on his shoulders. After the Apache delegation rode north, Jake stood looking at the work accomplished. The barn debris was cleared, new posts were set for the foundation, and plans were drawn for reconstruction. The settlers had proven willing to help once they understood the truth. But Jake knew the real test lay ahead. Russell Moore was still out there, probably with employers and resources behind him. Men who profited from conflict would not give up easily just because one scheme had been exposed. There would be more attempts to start a war, more clever manipulations, more violence designed to provoke retaliation. Jake walked to his cabin and examined the false symbols painted on the wall. Tomorrow he would scrub them away or paint over them. But tonight they served as a reminder of how easily truth could be twisted, how quickly fear could override reason, how much damage one man with bad intentions could accomplish. He thought about Billy out there somewhere with 2 other young warriors, convinced they were fighting for honor when they were really being used as pawns in someone else's game. He hoped Standing Bear's scouts would find them before they caused more harm or got themselves killed. As darkness fell, the remaining settlers gathered around a fire in Jake's yard, unwilling to leave him alone after the day's events. They roasted coffee and shared jerky, talking about the work ahead. The conversation was easy, almost normal, though Jake noticed everyone kept their weapons close and their eyes on the surrounding darkness. Tommy Walsh strummed a battered guitar, coaxing out a melody that drifted across the valley. It was peaceful this moment, but Jake couldn't shake the feeling that storms still gathered on the horizon. Part 5 would bring the confrontation with Russell Moore, the resolution of Billy's story, and the establishment of a new understanding between settlers and Apache, all while testing whether the fragile peace could survive when someone determined to destroy it made their final move. The next morning brought Marshal Duncan and 6 cavalry troopers. The marshal was a weathered man in his 50s, with sharp eyes that missed nothing, and a reputation for fairness that had earned him respect from settlers and tribes alike. He listened carefully to Jake's account, asked pointed questions, examined the false symbols, and inspected the barn remains. When Jake finished explaining everything, Duncan nodded slowly. "This Russell Moore sounds like trouble I've encountered before. Different names, same pattern. There's men who move through the territories finding points of conflict, making them worse, then profiting when land values collapse and desperate people sell cheap. What can we do about him?" Jake asked. Duncan stroked his mustache thoughtfully. "If we can catch him actively sabotaging peace, I can arrest him. But these types are slippery. They never leave evidence that connects them directly to violence. They suggest, they hint, they encourage others to act while keeping their own hands clean. We need to catch him in the act of planning or coordinating trouble." He looked at Jake with calculating interest. "You've become a figure of importance in this situation. Both sides trust you, or at least respect you. That makes you useful for drawing more out." Jake didn't like where this was heading. "You want to use me as bait?" Duncan shrugged. "I want to stop a war and catch a criminal. If that requires asking you to take some risks, well, you're already at risk anyway. Moore knows you exposed his scheme. He probably sees you as a threat to his plans. Better to confront him on our terms than wait for him to come after you on his." It was sound logic, but Jake still hesitated. He'd already been shot at once today by accident. Deliberately painting a target on himself seemed unwise. Martha spoke up from where she'd been listening. What exactly would Jake need to do? Duncan laid out his plan. Word would spread that Jake was meeting with Apache leaders to formalize a peace agreement, establishing trading relationships and mutual defense pacts that would stabilize the region. This would threaten anyone who wanted continued conflict. Moore would likely attempt to disrupt the meeting or eliminate Jake before it happened. "We set up the meeting at a location we control," Duncan explained. "Jake shows up as announced. We have men hidden around the area, waiting. When Moore makes his move, we catch him." "And if he doesn't make a move?" Jake asked. "If he's smart enough to stay away?" Duncan smiled grimly. "Then we've at least established the peace agreement, which is worth doing anyway. You lose nothing by trying, and you gain protection from both communities. That's not a bad outcome," Jake considered. The plan had risks, but doing nothing also had risks. Moore was still out there, still capable of causing harm. And the fragile peace between settlers and Apache needed reinforcement before the next crisis tested it. "All right," Jake said finally. "What do I need to do?" Over the next 3 days, preparations moved forward quickly. Duncan spread word through the settlements about the upcoming Peace Council, scheduled for Saturday morning at a neutral site 5 miles north of Jake's property. Standing Bear agreed to participate, bringing tribal elders and respected warriors to demonstrate Apache commitment to peaceful coexistence. The site chosen was a wide meadow surrounded by hills, offering good visibility and multiple approaches that could be monitored. Duncan positioned his troopers in hidden locations around the perimeter, watching for anyone approaching with hostile intent. Meanwhile, Jake lived at Martha's boarding house, aware that he'd become a target but trying to maintain normal routines. Several settlers stopped by to apologize for their suspicions, including Cole Fletcher, who brought a bottle of whiskey and a sincere expression of regret. "I let fear make me stupid," Fletcher admitted over drinks. Should have known better than to assume the worst without evidence. My grandfather always said panic is more dangerous than the thing you're panicking about. Guess I forgot that lesson. Jake accepted the apology and the whiskey, both offered in good faith. On Thursday evening, 2 nights before the scheduled council, Billy and the other 2 young raiders were captured by Standing Bear's scouts in the Silver Creek High Country. The young warriors were brought back to the Apache village, where they would face judgment from the tribal elders. Standing Bear sent a messenger to Jake with details. Billy admits he was encouraged by the white man Moore to raid the settler ranch. Moore told him it would prove his bravery, that Nayland would respect him if he struck a blow against the encroaching whites. Billy now sees he was used. He wishes to apologize to you and to the injured settler. The elders will decide his punishment, but he will live. Young men are allowed mistakes if they learn from them. Jake appreciated the message, but wondered if Billy had truly learned anything or simply been caught. Time would tell if the young warrior's remorse was genuine or just fear of punishment. Either way, it removed one volatile element from the situation. Friday morning brought unexpected news. A stranger rode into Red Creek asking questions about Jake Carson, about the upcoming Peace Council, about how many people would be attending. Brennan, alerted to watch for suspicious characters, engaged the man in conversation while Tommy Walsh slipped out the back to alert Marshal Duncan. The stranger claimed to be a journalist from the territorial newspaper, interested in covering the historic peace agreement. But he asked military questions disguised as journalistic curiosity, wanting to know about security arrangements, about who would be positioned where. Duncan arrived with 2 troopers and politely invited the stranger to the marshal's office for further questioning. The man initially maintained his journalist cover, but broke quickly under Duncan's experienced interrogation. He admitted to being hired by Russell Moore to gather intelligence about the Peace Council. Moore planned to disrupt the meeting, but needed to know security details to plan his approach. The stranger, whose real name was Pete Griffin, agreed to cooperate in exchange for leniency. He'd been promised $50 to scout the situation, a fortune for someone desperate enough to take such work. "Where's Moore now?" Duncan demanded. Griffin shook his head. "I don't know. He never told me where he camps. I was supposed to meet him tomorrow morning at dawn, 2 miles east of the council site, to report what I learned. He'd pay me then." Duncan smiled coldly. "Perfect. You're going to that meeting exactly as planned. But you're going to tell Moore what I want him to hear. You're going to tell him that Jake Carson will arrive at the council site early, around 6 in the morning, to check preparations before the others arrive. You're going to tell him that Carson will be alone for about an hour before security shows up. Think you can remember that?" Griffin nodded eagerly, desperate to avoid jail time. Duncan laid out the revised plan. Griffin would meet Moore as scheduled and deliver the false intelligence. Moore would likely see this as a perfect opportunity to eliminate Jake before the Peace Council began, probably hoping to blame Apache warriors for the killing and restart the conflict. Duncan's men would be waiting in hidden positions around the council site. When Moore made his move against Jake, they'd capture him with clear evidence of attempted murder. "It's risky," Duncan admitted to Jake. "You'll be exposed for real, even though we'll be watching. If something goes wrong, if Moore brings more men than we expect, you could get hurt before we can intervene." Jake had spent 2 days thinking about this plan and its dangers. He'd also spent 2 days watching the community come together, watching settlers and Apache work toward understanding instead of violence. Whatever risks he faced personally seemed small compared to the potential for lasting peace. "I'll do it," he said simply. Duncan clasped his shoulder. "Brave man. Foolish but brave. Let's make sure your foolishness doesn't get you killed." They spent Friday evening reviewing the plan in detail, positioning Duncan's men around the meadow site, establishing signals and fallback positions. Standing Bear brought 3 of his best warriors to add to the security force, men who could move silently through the hills and spot approaching threats before white soldiers could. Saturday morning arrived cold and clear, the sun still below the eastern peaks when Jake rode Lucy into the meadow. He dismounted and began setting up benches and a simple speaking platform, trying to appear focused on preparations while staying hyper-aware of his surroundings. The hills were quiet, no visible movement, but Jake knew at least a dozen armed men watched from hidden positions. Somewhere out there, Russell Moore was approaching, confident that he'd found the perfect moment to eliminate the threat Jake represented to his schemes. Jake worked steadily, moving supplies, arranging seating, keeping his rifle close but not obviously ready. The sun climbed higher, painting the meadow grass gold. Birds sang in the surrounding pines, oblivious to the human drama unfolding. Jake's nerves stretched tighter with each passing minute. Where was Moore? Had he seen through the trap? Was he even now riding away, abandoning this approach in favor of some other plan? Then Jake heard a sound that made his blood freeze, a rifle being cocked close behind him. He turned slowly and saw Russell Moore standing at the meadow edge, a Winchester pointed steadily at Jake's chest. Moore was exactly as described. Tall, thin, nervous hands, scar on his left cheek, but his eyes were calm and calculating, the eyes of a man who'd done this kind of thing before and expected to do it again. "Morning, Carson," Moore said pleasantly. "Beautiful day for it. Shame you won't live to see noon." Jake kept his hands visible and away from his own rifle, which leaned against a bench 15 feet away. "You're Moore, the man who's been starting fires so he can profit from the ashes." Moore smiled. "Poetic. I like that. But inaccurate. I don't start fires. I simply recognize situations where fire is inevitable and make sure I'm positioned to benefit when it happens." The Apache and settlers in this territory were always going to fight. Too much history, too many grievances, too much competition for limited resources. I just accelerated the timeline slightly. "People could have died," Jake said, stalling for time, hoping Duncan's men were moving into position. "People did die," Moore corrected. "Frank Morrison almost died. Others would have followed. That's the nature of frontier life. Conflict is constant. I simply guided toward outcomes that serve my purposes." Jake noticed Moore's rifle barrel wavering slightly, the nervous hands betraying tension despite his calm voice. "Who are you working for? Land speculators? Mining companies? Railroad interests?" Moore laughed. "All of them. None of them. It doesn't matter. There are always buyers for cheap land acquired from desperate sellers. My job is to create the desperation. The buying and selling happens through other channels." Jake saw movement in the trees behind Moore, just a shadow shifting position. Duncan's men were closing in. Jake needed to keep Moore talking, keep him focused forward instead of checking his surroundings. "The Peace Council will happen anyway. Killing me won't stop it."
"You've already failed." Moore's smile faded.
"Actually, killing you accomplishes exactly what I need. You die at the Peace Council site, shot by an Apache rifle I'll leave beside your body." Settlers arrived to find their bridge builder murdered by the very people he trusted. Apache arrived to find themselves accused of betrayal. Everything you've worked to build collapses in suspicion and rage. The war I wanted happens anyway, just delayed by a few days. It was a good plan, Jake had to admit. Simple, direct, effective. Moore had clearly done this before, knew how to manipulate situations and people. But he'd made one critical mistake. He'd underestimated how many people now had a stake in peace, how many were watching to protect what had been built. "You're wrong about one thing," Jake said quietly. "I'm not the bridge. I'm just one plank in a bridge that many people are building together. You can remove me, but the structure will stand anyway." Moore's rifle steadied, finger tightening on the trigger. "Pretty speech. Won't matter much when you're dead. Goodbye, Carson." The shot rang out, but not from Moore's rifle. The Winchester flew from Moore's hands as a bullet from Standing Bear's warrior knocked it away. Moore spun, reaching for a pistol at his belt, but Duncan and 2 troopers emerged from cover with rifles aimed. "Federal Marshal," Duncan called. "Drop your weapon and put your hands up now." For a moment Moore seemed to consider fighting, his hand hovering near the pistol. Then reality settled over him and he slowly raised his hands. Duncan's men moved in quickly, disarming and restraining him while reading charges. Attempted murder, conspiracy to incite violence, fraud, illegal manipulation of federal territories. The list was long and damning. Jake walked over to examine Moore more closely. The man who'd caused so much trouble looked ordinary up close, almost unremarkable. That was probably part of his success, Jake thought. People overlooked the ordinary, never suspecting that behind an average face might lurk a mind dedicated to exploitation and chaos. "Why?" Jake asked. "You've got education, intelligence, skills. You could make an honest living." "Why this?" Moore met his gaze with something like contempt. "Honest living? That's for men. Content with scraping by, grateful for whatever crumbs the powerful throw them. I chose to be powerful instead, to profit from the systems that grind up ordinary men like you. If you're too stupid or too noble to do the same, that's your limitation, not mine." Duncan pulled Moore away before Jake could respond. Probably for the best, Jake thought. Nothing he said would change a mind that twisted, that committed to seeing human suffering as just another resource to exploit. As troopers led Moore toward horses for the ride to the territorial capital and trial, more riders arrived at the meadow. Standing Bear and his delegation, right on schedule. Nayland rode beside her father, and when she saw Jake standing unharmed, her face broke into a relieved smile. Behind them came settlers from Red Creek and surrounding ranches, wagons loaded with food for the feast that would follow the council. The peace gathering was happening exactly as planned, only now with the added triumph of having captured the man who tried to prevent it. The council itself was simple but profound. Standing Bear and Marshal Duncan spoke about the need for cooperation, about respecting boundaries and treaty agreements, about establishing trading relationships that benefited both communities. Jake was asked to speak, and though he hated public attention, he stood before the assembled group and told the truth simply. I fixed a wagon wheel because it was the right thing to do. Everything that's happened since came from that one choice. But it wasn't just my choice that mattered. Chief Standing Bear chose to listen when his daughter told him the truth. Marshal Duncan chose to investigate rather than assume guilt. Many of you chose to help rebuild my barn instead of continuing to see enemies everywhere. Peace isn't one person's work or one moment's decision. It's 100 small choices made by different people who decide that cooperation serves everyone better than conflict. The speech was met with approval from both sides, and the feast that followed lasted into the evening. Jake found himself in conversations with Apache elders about farming techniques, with settlers about trade goods the tribe needed, with Duncan about formalizing protection agreements. Nolan sought him out as the sun set, the meadow now lit by bonfire light and filled with the sounds of mixed celebration. You survived, she said with a smile. I was worried when I heard about Moore's plan. You could have refused to be bait, Jake shrugged. Could have. But then what? Wait for him to try something when we weren't ready? Better to face problems on your terms than let them ambush you on theirs. You sound like a warrior, Nayland observed. Maybe, Jake said. Or maybe I've just learned that fixing things sometimes requires breaking them first, or at least exposing what's already broken so it can be properly repaired. They stood in comfortable silence, watching Apache and settlers share food and stories around the fires. It wasn't perfect peace, Jake knew. There would be tensions, misunderstandings, probably more conflicts ahead. But the foundation had been laid for something better than constant warfare, something that might last if enough people chose to maintain it. Over the following weeks, life settled into a new normal. Jake's barn was rebuilt, larger and sturdier than before, a community effort that involved both settlers and Apache workers. Billy appeared one morning with 2 other young warriors sent by Standing Bear to help with the final construction as part of his punishment and restitution. The young warrior worked in silence most of the day, clearly uncomfortable, until Jake finally called a break and offered water. I was foolish, Billy said quietly, the first words he'd spoken. Moore told me things I wanted to hear, promised that striking against settlers would make me a hero. I believed him because I was angry and hurt. I see now that he only wanted to use me to cause trouble, Jake nodded. We all get used sometimes, especially when we're young and feeling strong emotions. The question is whether you learn from it. Billy met his eyes. I am learning. Chief Standing Bear says I must work to rebuild what I helped damage, not just your barn, but trust between our peoples. He says this'll take years, maybe my whole life. I accept this. Jake respected that answer. True growth came from accepting consequences and committing to better choices going forward. Billy might become a good man eventually, if he stayed on this path. The Peace Council became a regular event, held monthly to address ongoing concerns and strengthen relationships. Trade agreements were formalized, with Apache craftwork exchanged for settler tools and supplies. Security arrangements were established, with both communities agreeing to share information about threats and assist each other against external dangers. It wasn't perfect, but it worked better than the alternative of constant suspicion and violence. Russell Moore was tried in the territorial capital and convicted on multiple charges. He received 20 years hard labor, a sentence that surprised no one given the evidence against him and the number of communities he damaged with his schemes. During the trial, investigators uncovered his connections to a network of land speculators who'd been operating throughout the Western Territories for years, using similar tactics to acquire valuable properties at artificially low prices. The publicity from Moore's conviction led to reforms in how territorial land sales were regulated, making it harder for such schemes to succeed in the future. Jake received offers to serve as an official liaison between settlers and Apache, a paid position with the territorial government. He declined, preferring to maintain his independence and his role as someone trusted by both sides precisely because he held no official authority. Instead, he continued doing what he did best, fixing wagons, fences, tools, problems, relationships. He found satisfaction in the work itself, in seeing broken things made whole, in watching communities function better because of small repairs and careful maintenance. One evening, 6 months after the Peace Council, Jake sat on his rebuilt porch watching the sunset paint the hills gold and purple. Nalin rode up, her paint horse moving easily across the familiar ground. She dismounted and joined him on the porch, accepting the coffee he offered. "My father wanted me to tell you something," she said. "The elders have given you an Apache name, Nantahe. It means he who fixes what is broken. They say this is who you are, in your spirit, regardless of whether you were born Apache or white." Jake felt unexpected emotion at the honor. "Tell them I am grateful. Tell them I will try to live up to that name." Nalin smiled. "You already do, every day, in small ways and large ones." That is what names mean in our culture. They describe what is, not what should be. They sat in comfortable silence as darkness fell. Two people from different worlds who'd helped build a bridge between them. It wasn't the future Jake had imagined when he fixed that wagon wheel months ago. But it was good. This new role, this unexpected purpose. He'd learned that sometimes the most important repairs were to relationships, to trust, to the social fabric that held communities together. Those fixes didn't show as clearly as a mended wagon or a rebuilt barn, but they mattered just as much, maybe more. As stars emerged overhead, Jake thought about everything that had happened. The violence, the suspicion, the near war, the choices made by dozens of people that led to peace instead of catastrophe. It could have gone differently so easily, one wrong word or one rash action tipping everything into bloodshed. But it hadn't, because enough people chose differently, chose patience over panic, truth over assumption, cooperation over conflict. That was the real lesson, Jake decided. The world bent toward justice and peace only when individuals bent it that way through conscious choices, made one at a time in moments when the easy choice was anger or fear. He'd made his choices and others had made theirs, and together they'd built something worth protecting. That was enough. That was everything.